Hello, everyone. I'm Bridget Helms, Executive Director at Miller Center for Social Entrepreneurship, and I'm so pleased to welcome you all to the Miller Center and Chevron Social Entrepreneurship and Corporate Supply Chain panel. We look forward to a terrific discussion. Our panel today is part of a broader Miller Center and Chevron partnership where we are looking to further climate smart agriculture, safe water, and reliable low carbon energy sources into very vulnerable communities in the Asia Pacific region. And this is accomplished through customized support to high potential social entrepreneurs. This focused support helps us to position the social entrepreneurs to break through the barriers that they see to scale, to improve their financial sustainability, and importantly, to secure the kind of capital that they need in order to grow. And today we're discussing corporate supply chains as a topic is super interesting to me personally and very relevant to social entrepreneurs, no matter where they are located around the world. We are going to hear from executives from Chevron and SAP, from Miller Center alumni, social entrepreneurs who are going to discuss from their perspective, their experiences in accessing supply chains with larger corporate entities, and really just trying to dig in and understand how these programs work and how social entrepreneurs can get involved. So our panel includes Dee Bourbon from Chevron, Senior Social Investment Advisor, Timothy McCarthy, who's the General Manager of Supply Chain Operations for Chevron, Alexandra Vanderplug, who is the head of corporate social responsibility for SAP, as well as three social entrepreneur alumni from Miller Center's network. First, we have Zubaida Bai. He's the president and CEO of Grameen Foundation. It focuses on using innovation and technology so that marginalized populations, especially women and girls, can strengthen their resilience and financial security, increase incomes and well-being, and build paths to successful entrepreneurial ventures. We have Galen Welsh. He's co-founder and CEO of Jibu, a for-profit social enterprise that capitalizes, equips, and trains emerging market entrepreneurs to launch and grow essential service franchises with drinking water as its first anchor product. And then we have Nadine Abdallah. She's the head of growth and partnerships for Someone Somewhere, a certified B Corporation in Mexico that provides sustainable livelihoods for artisans by integrating environmentally conscious and traditional techniques into innovative activewear and accessories. Dee, I'm hoping that you can add a few thoughts before we officially begin with this amazing panel.
Thanks very much, Bridget. And on behalf of Chevron as well, I just wanted to thank everyone on the panel for coming along today to really start exploring and unpacking this question around social enterprises and supply chains. You know, at Chevron, we aim to create prosperity everywhere that we work. And a big part of that is actually developing local businesses and supporting programs such as our work with Miller Center that looks at how do we increase social enterprises who are working on problems for their own communities. In this current case with Miller Center, it's around climate smart agriculture, safe drinking water, and lower carbon energy. Now, we think that the future of the world is a lower carbon future, and supporting programs like this actually helps build a whole constellation of solutions that can work towards that mutual goal that we all have. You know, I've been working with Miller Center now, I think, Bridget, for about 3.5 years, and I've seen the power of these programs to really help the social enterprises develop in such a way that there is a much better chance that they can engage with larger and larger supply chains. But I think there's still a lot of challenges. And hopefully through our session today, we can explore some of those challenges, you know, from a large corporation, explain the different ways that social enterprises can engage with the corporate supply chain panel. And I'm really curious to hear from the social enterprises today around how we can do better. So I'm excited to hear everyone's views today, and I hope this is a very productive session for people who are sitting on both sides of the supply channel. Thanks very much.
Terrific, terrific. Thank you for that, and thank you for your support. So we all agree that social entrepreneurship ecosystem needs broader kind of support from the corporate world beyond traditional kind of corporate social responsibility. And there's an increasing focus on procurement and supply chains, talking about things like social and inclusive, responsible supply chains, things like that. And there is a lot of progress that's being made. However, from the perspective of many of the entrepreneurs in our ecosystem, there's still a lot of progress that we can make. and especially, I think a lot of entrepreneurs that we work with are interested in understanding how can they get in, how do they fit in? And I think that's really the overarching focus of our discussion today. And I'd really like to start with the entrepreneurs and get their perspectives, So starting with Zubaida, the two questions I'd love you to address in your kind of opening remarks here are, what are the challenges that you see in trying to access corporate supply chains, and what should change?
Oh, thank you, Bridget, and thank you, Dee, for everything you're doing here at Chevron, and Bridget for everything you do at the Miller Center. So in my role, I think in the last 2 decades of my career, I started off as an engineer, really building hands-on projects with the last mile women in agriculture and healthcare. And at that point, integrating the manufacturing of high impact technologies into corporate supply chains was a challenge. Moved on to my career in investment, and there I saw that there was very hard to get corporates to work with early stage companies or early stage innovators with technologies. And now in my role, then I moved on as an entrepreneur. As a decade there, I really saw the challenges in scaling high impact technologies, whereas corporates had access to that in terms of how do you engage with corporations to reach the last mile. And now in my role at Grameen, I think the real focus that I'm seeing is how do you build gender into corporate supply chain. So I think there's been variations through the 2 decades of my career that I've seen as an engineer, as an investor, as an entrepreneur, and now leading a large INGO. It's like, how do you, within Grameen, for us, our goal is to transform systems for women and girls. And, as we all know, there's over 1 billion women who don't have access to bank accounts, markets, access, business training. How do you leverage the last mile access that corporates have in terms of reaching these last mile communities with innovation, technology? But most importantly, how do you put a gender lens to it? How do you serve these communities using corporates and focus on women and girls? We have a few examples at Grameen where we've had success over the last 5 years. We work with Walmart Foundation in India, where the biggest challenge we see is how do you take the last mile smallholder farmer produce and integrate it into a formal supply chain. And what we're seeing there is the lack of how do I put it, the unseen women in supply chains, right? So even though women are working in the farm, over 80% of women are actually working in the fields, but they don't have a voice, they are not seen. So our first phase with Walmart Foundation was how do you actually bring women into the supply chain? How do you actually give them a voice? How do you see them in the supply chain? And that's been hugely successful by increasing access by over 200%, by forming them into farmer producer organizations, giving them access to training, giving them access to digital skills, but most importantly, bringing women into the equation where 98% of farmer producer organizations didn't have a single woman on them. So how do you do that? So that was one thing we did with Walmart Foundation. Another example we have in the Philippines is with Berry Calaba, which is another corporation where we worked with them in integrating coconut farmers at the last mile, again, bringing women to the table. But how do you dismantle the system where coconut farmers are being scrutinized by various various metrics that they need to meet. How do you educate them? How do you give them digital access? How do you bring them into the formal supply chains? And how do you integrate them directly by enabling them into corporate supply chains like Berry Callebaut? Because coconut is a very important ingredient in chocolate manufacturing, as you know. So I think these are a few examples on how we are actually increasing by over 100% participation of women, engaging them into formal markets, giving them a voice. And I think there is a lot to be said in terms of the challenges on I would say very specifically on how to integrate women and girls into the supply chain, how to integrate technology, and corporations have a huge role to play there. And the last thing I would like to say is there is an aspect of, yes, we always think about gender at the last mile and women and girls at the last mile, but there's also this aspect at Grameen now we're trying to fix is how do you educate corporations on what does that mean? How do you educate people like you and me? When I entered Grameen, I took the training and I was like, wow, I didn't know so much about how women and girls think, what their needs are, what their challenges are. So how do you bring that education not just to the last mile in terms of what they need to be integrated into markets, but also into corporations to how do they understand what the challenges at the last mile are? So I think those are a few things that I see from where I sit today as an INGO. And as a social entrepreneur, I think INGOs can play such a huge role in scaling what social entrepreneurs can do. And I think the sector is missing that. And as an entrepreneur myself, I see this platform as to how do you leverage innovations in technology, climate, agriculture for these social entrepreneurs, and how do you take them to scale with an INGO intervention? So I think that's where I stand today.
Thank you. Thank you so much that's a very rich introduction around challenges around women and girls and last mile connectivity to corporations. It feels like very far away in a lot of ways. Let me now turn to Galen. Let's hear your thoughts. What are the challenges that you are seeing in trying to access corporate supply chains, and what should change?
Thanks everyone for organizing this. It's a really interesting topic, and I think the very existence of this panel addresses what I feel is one of the biggest problems, and that's just sort of ignorance on the social enterprise side around what corporate supply chains exist and what value they can add to social entrepreneurs doing last mile distribution, as well as what value SEs can add to corporations. So generally, I find it very difficult to be aware of who's operating where, in what context, and how we can tap into it. So I think just sort of the mapping of the ecosystem, which is I think corporate to corporate tends to be sort of common knowledge of who operates where and how, but at the social enterprise level, especially in the emerging market context, we just don't have much exposure to that. So I think that the actual basic information around market is missing. And then another piece that I see is the ability for social enterprises to add value to corporates as far as designing product and last mile delivery. So similar to what Zubaida said, I think the key function that social enterprise can play is that last mile delivery component. But I think there has to be a voice that social enterprises have as far as being able to design and adapt products for that last mile reach. So an example is one of our investors is Danone. And we've really wanted to design a fortified and flavored water product. But just to get the information around what inventory is available at Danone, even with them as an investor, has been very difficult to be able to convert all of the incredible R&D power they have into a product that really works for last mile in the markets where we operate. So I think that I guess just to summarize, first of all, who's doing what where, and then second of all, how can SEs communicate product and design and distribution adaptations to corporates to allow corporates to play a bigger role in these markets. Thanks.
Okay, these are really interesting remarks to get started, and hopefully it gives you some food for thought for the corporate folks who are going to chat with us right now. Okay, let's hear now from Tim, and who's going to talk to us about Chevron's corporate supply chain, how it works, and examples of organizations that have been able to access the system. So Tim, let's hear from you.
Thanks, Bridget. Karen, could I ask that you bring up the slides? We have a few slides to talk to this evening. Fantastic. Okay, look, again, thank you, Bridget, and thank all of you. It was very interesting to hear from the social entrepreneurs about the challenges they face. And we sincerely hope our presentation today, in the morning for most of you, gives you a few ideas on how to approach a large corporation like Chevron. Advance the slides, please. Look, to begin, I know we have folks here and will, as we circulate this from different parts of the world, so I want to provide a very brief overview of the company. Chevron is the second largest oil and gas company headquartered in the US. We're focused on safely delivering lower carbon energy in a growing world. And to support that business, we have a global workforce of more than 38,000 employees and a diverse and inclusive supply chain filled with companies and capable people like all of you that reflect the communities where we live and work. And to support these communities, we invest in health, education, the environment, and economic development everywhere we are, and our work with Miller Center is an example of that investment in economic development. Go ahead and advance the slide. Look, Chevron's involved in virtually every facet of the energy industry. We explore, forward, produce, and transport oil and natural gas. We manufacture fuels, lubricants, petrochemicals, and additives. We're growing new lower carbon businesses in renewables, hydrogen, carbon capture, and offsets. And we are always looking to develop and deploy technology that enhance our business value across our operations. Our products are sold in about 150 countries around the globe. And many of you in the Pacific region may know one of our retail brands, Caltex. But having a global presence across the entire energy industry means that the opportunities for local businesses to be part of the supply chain can vary significantly, depending on what's produced, sold, or transported in each market where you intend to operate. Go ahead and advance the slides. Thank you. So look, let's look at that global presence for a second. And this is from an upstream point of view. As you can see from the map in the ovals, we have major upstream operations and production across the globe. Exploration is also essential to our business, and those are the blue boxes. And our current focus areas for exploration are deepwater US Gulf of Mexico, offshore Western Australia, West Africa, as well as the United States, Canada, and Argentina. We are very active and well positioned in the energy industry to meet that global demand. Go ahead and go forward. By contrast, our global downstream business consists of refineries and manufacturing facilities focused on fuels and products which are sold under the Chevron, Texaco, and Caltex brands. And our refineries in Singapore, Thailand, South Korea, as well as those in California, in Richmond and El Segundo, they manufacture products primarily for the Pacific Basin. Our refineries in Pascagoula, Mississippi, and Pasadena, Texas, primarily supply countries in the Atlantic Basin. All right, take me forward. In the locations we operate, Chevron has programs. It depends on the location as to how many, but these programs support our commitment to social investment, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Our supplier diversity strategies include aspirational goals to utilize and develop local business and small businesses, women, minority, and veteran-owned businesses, businesses owned by individuals who are LGBTQ+, and businesses owned by persons who are disabled. We also partner with organizations to create those meaningful opportunities to become a supplier to Chevron. Go ahead and advance. And so becoming a supplier for Chevron. Look, wanted to highlight 3 ways businesses like yours can engage with Chevron's supply chain and provide a brief case history to illustrate each. First, starting on the left, you can contract directly with Chevron. And I feel many of you would prefer this. But for companies like ours, direct contracting requires a few things. First, you have to be able to navigate a rigorous contracting process. You need to have well-established systems and standards. We look for that. We look for established companies and expect the delivery of what they provide in products and services to represent those standards and established systems. We also expect some specialized industry knowledge or technology. Generally, we're looking for that to enhance our business. So companies that provide that specialized industry technology are preferred. And in most cases, even having demonstrated oil and gas experience is a preference of ours. And all this can be challenging for small businesses, social entrepreneurs to navigate. In Australia, we utilize a third party called ICN, Industry Capability Network. And what they do for us or through that organization, we're able to identify suitable vendors to work with us directly. And I'll talk about that when we get to the case history. The second one, the center method to engage, is to subcontract through an existing tier 1 contractor or business aggregator. This is most often more suitable to smaller organizations since you can leverage the main contractor's systems and know-how. Tier 1 contractors generally have a more agile contracting process and can provide more hands-on management and business support. Working with a tier 1 contractor also means you work under their safety systems. So through this method, you don't have the added burden of those systems and policies and processes. It's just an easier path. The third way, the far right, is through a government or industry program that helps targeting small to medium enterprises of various varieties. These programs often appeal to startups and innovators who are at that minimum viable product stage. In essence, these programs are designed to support those small and medium enterprises. The contracting process for these, in fact, can be fit for purpose, and it can incorporate R&D opportunities that usually don't exist in the more traditional tendering and contracting pathways. My strongest piece of advice is that you need to understand the supply chain ecosystems for the industry and market you want to work with. Once you understand the needs of that market and who's currently meeting those needs, then you can seek out that additional support from the right entity, government programs, or accelerators like Miller System. They can help you focus your efforts on networking with the right parts of that ecosystem. But let's move to the case studies. Go ahead and advance, please. So this is an example of that direct contracting. In Australia, Chevron partners with a National Industry Capability Network, ICN, with branches in each state of Australia and New Zealand. And the network that they've created, been in place for about 35 years, intended to increase economic activity and employment opportunities for local industries. Their platform, their gateway, is widely used to connect companies and suppliers. We use it. We've been a long-term partner of ICN, and we use it to highlight upcoming procurement and contracting opportunities, packages for the market. We access the database as well of over 80,000 suppliers, and through that, select suppliers to be part of our sourcing process. This flowchart is intended to give a feel for that process, but all of this is available on the ICN sites, and ICN, as I say, is well established to support this, and ICN Industry Capability Network. We'll go on to the next example. So the indirect. Look, this example is about a small Indigenous-owned business which began as an indirect and was, when we get to the end of the story, ultimately able to contract with us directly. It took a few years, but contracting directly and actually expanding their business. So Koya Consulting was originally contracted in 2008 to run cultural awareness training for our employees. In 2013, Koya diversified into a nationwide office and stationery supply business called Kubari. And also, Koya Fleet Solutions was established, which at the time was the first Australian Aboriginally owned and operated fleet management company. Within a few years, both of these entities won direct contracts, one by competing for a light vehicle supply to one of our assets in Western Australia, and the other providing the stationery to our offices in Perth. And they did this a few years in around 2013 and have done so ever since. The great step out beyond that even is Coolbardie, the organization now channels a part of their profits aimed at improving how Aboriginal businesses can work with enterprises and entrepreneurial leaders to develop and do more business. And as you can see, Sharna Collard, the CEO of Kuya Fleet Solutions, has been recognized for these achievements. And so look, this is a case that demonstrates that even a small business can ultimately develop that direct contract with a large organization like ours. And so I'll move to the final case study. So direct, indirect, and through some government and or industry program. This final example is from an innovation challenge organized by NERA, the National Energy Resources Australia. This particular challenge, it can be a good way for businesses to showcase their technology solutions to potential investors to help commercialize or scale a product. What we did, the Chevron challenge offered to the industry was to reduce safety risks to personnel through the use of drones. The drones needed to be capable of carrying specific equipment and certified to fly into hazardous areas. We posted the challenge through NERA. We had 27 businesses lodge expressions of interest, of which 15 were shortlisted. Of those 15, then they did business pitches to Chevron, and 5 moved forward into the deep dive session. Ultimately, 2 businesses were selected and proceeded with the phase 1 pilots of the proposed 2-phase solution. Phase 1 is now complete and proved the use of these commercial available drones with methane detection lasers on board. That's the packages they were able to carry. Proved the viability of this. The phase 2 is now underway. And our intent in phase 2 is to develop a more custom flight platform with a truly low ignition source that we hope will gain formal certification for use in these hazardous areas, bringing together the 2 objectives of the challenge. But that was a very exciting and ultimately fruitful exercise from many to few, but the right few to deliver to us. Go ahead and take me forward. Look, 3 different ways, 3 case histories. We have more case histories than this, but we hope that the brief overview of the case histories have helped you understand Chevron and how social entrepreneurs can look for entry points in our business. Are these the only ones? No, there's subtle differences and options therein, but these are the 3 main pathways. And look, I encourage anyone to look at the Chevron websites in the countries where you operate to see how that local Chevron entity works with vendors and how you're best able to engage that local ecosystem.
Thank you so much for that presentation. So interesting to see your approach and process and the 3 different modalities. I think definitely the direct modality would seem to be the most challenging, obviously, and maybe the farthest away from many of the entrepreneurs that we work with, but not impossible, as we will hear a little bit later from Nadine. But before we get to that, I would love to hear now from you, Alex. SAP is quite well known as a leader, and yourself driving a lot of that leadership. So thank you for that. Involved in all kinds of programs incorporating social entrepreneurs into supply chains. Can you tell us a little bit more about what you're up to?
Absolutely. And maybe to explain sort of why we focus on what we do, it might be helpful to understand who SAP is as a company, because that drives a lot of the work that we do, very obviously. So for those of you who don't know, SAP is a market leader in the enterprise application software space. And basically what we do is we help companies of all sizes and in all industry to run better. and to achieve positive economic, environmental, and social impact. And we basically do that by helping redefine what ERP is. And we create networks of intelligent enterprises that provide transparency, resiliency, and sustainability across supply chains. So you're already hearing a lot of the buzzwords in sort of our company profile positioning. We have over 400,000 customers worldwide, 105,000 employees in about 150 countries. So a large multinational. But when you sort of look at that, and then when I look at the social enterprise sector and the social economy, there's very naturally 3 areas for us to work in. And it also explains how and why we're engaged with social enterprises. One, we see the social enterprise sector as an industry, like any other industries and any other companies that we support, and that we try to help be better at what they do. Of course, in the case of the social enterprise sector, it's maybe a little bit less on the SAP technology side, but we focus primarily on build capacity for social enterprises so that they can run their operations better and increase the impact that they can generate on the environmental and social mission that they have. So that's one area. But 2, one of the biggest levers that we really have is, you heard me say that we have 400,000 customers globally. And all of them have ESG and sustainability goals these days that they need to achieve. So as you can imagine, one of the biggest levers for us is actually our SAP technology, is figuring out how can we help our customers and our partners to achieve their ESG and sustainability goals. And we believe that social enterprises and social economy players play a fundamental role for the private sector in achieving their ESG and sustainability goals. And then 3, it's obviously about our own practices as well. It's about our own ESG and sustainability goals and looking at how can we work with social enterprises through business relationships to help us achieve those goals. So those are the 3 areas that, that define how we work with the social enterprise sector. And we've been doing this for 13, 14 years now. But I'll also be very honest with you. It's not all roses and sunshine. And it isn't as if, you know, the business was already completely convinced about engaging with the social enterprise sector 13, 14 years ago. I'll be very honest to admit that I think until about 4 years ago, the CSR team were the lone wolf in saying the social enterprises are incredibly important. We need to work with them. And in the business, people would look at us and go like, okay, we don't understand it. We don't understand what social enterprises are. We don't understand why they should be important. That has definitely changed in the last 4 or 5 years. And I think a lot of that has to do with you know, the increasing need for transparency that companies have with regards to their supply chains, but also the increasing needs that companies have to be more sustainable and to be more responsible. And realizing that social enterprises are actually innovation drivers for social and environmental change, much more than very often the multinationals are, right? Because we tend to be a bit slow and and not as agile as social enterprises potentially are. Now, concretely, what do we do? And there, maybe I will share a few slides. I wasn't sure whether I was going to, but I think I will, just to sort of visualize it a little bit better. One very important aspect for us when working with social enterprises is, and I think this came through already when Tim was speaking, and also when the social entrepreneurs were sharing the challenges that they were facing in connecting with corporates. Unfortunately, what we've seen is that a lot of social enterprises are not yet ready to engage with corporates in a business relationship from a procurement perspective, right? And at the same time, corporates, also very honestly, are also sometimes not ready to engage with social enterprises because they have antiquated guidelines and practices and procedures around procurement that doesn't fit with a social enterprise environment. So on both sides, both the corporate side as well as the social enterprise side, there's a lot of capacity building that needs to happen. So we invest a lot of our efforts in developing programs, platforms, and initiatives to link SAP employees with social enterprises and help them with key strategic challenges that they're facing. Sometimes that is to prepare them for a B2B relationship with the corporate sector. Sometimes it's really just about their own business operations and it has nothing to do with the B2B market per se. So we're not exclusively working with social enterprises that want to enter the B2B market. This is a really big part of the work that we do. And this year alone, we have about, I would say, 700 to 800 SAP employees who are engaging with social enterprises across the world. We haven't stopped there though yet, because we've always said our biggest lever is our incredible network and ecosystem that we have as SAP. So we're working with SAP customers and partners to enable the linking, the connecting between companies and social enterprises for non-financial support. To that end, we created a platform called the Transform Support Hub, together with our friends at Unilever, EY, and Moving Worlds. And it's basically the platform we use at SAP to provide virtual pro bono consulting to social enterprises, but we're basically have built it up in such a way that any company can join us and any social enterprise can request non-financial support through the Transform Support Hub. So that's one big way for us. The other big topic is the whole topic of biosocial and social procurement. And I think the slides are sharing now, right? So next to building capacity that I've already spoken about, SAP technology obviously does play a significant role. And we have just looked at, we've been working in the last 5 years in figuring out how do we increase the visibility of social enterprises to corporate players in their procurement processes. And we found a way now through SAP technology to be able to do that. So we've incorporated functionality in SAP's Business Network, which is one of the biggest marketplaces, B2B marketplaces that exist. And we have just done a soft launch. So towards the end of this year, there will be an official announcement and launch of that functionality. And that will basically create significantly more visibility for social enterprises. So if you as a corporate, if Chevron, for example, says, we want to purchase from a social enterprise in South Africa, they could, through that flag and tag, identify social enterprises in that market and that pop up. The other thing that we're working on together with our partners is on social enterprise verification. I think we all know that this is a huge topic. There is not one certification for social enterprises across the globe. There's so many different regulation, legislation. Unfortunately, many countries that don't have any legislation or regulation around social enterprises. So we're working with our partners to create a bit of a standard there. So that there is a social enterprise verification that is then easier to link into corporate supply chains. And last but not least, we're working very hard at creating the market for social procurement and biosocial. And that is basically, we're taking a bit of a market by market approach with that, where we're trying to build networks and ecosystems in individual markets to enable the connection between social enterprises and corporates in different markets so that they can find each other in a B2B relationship. We do that through partnerships with the Global Alliance for Social Entrepreneurship that is hosted by the World Economic Forum, also with organizations like Catalyst 2030 and many others. So this is the work that is happening on our end. And of course, next to that, we also want to embed social enterprises ourselves into our procurement spend. And like what Tim has mentioned quite well, I mean, it's not easy on our end either. It's I have to admit, it's quite a high touch process at the moment, quite a manual process, unfortunately. But we are able to show quite a bit of success in certain areas where we can embed social enterprises and make them visible to the individual buyers within SAP. and start forming those relationships. So that's what's happening on our end. And I hope that you found this useful, and I'm looking forward to the continued conversation on this.
Well, thank you so much, Alex. That is really impressive, all the work that you're doing. And I think these kinds of platforms and communities and ecosystem building efforts are super important, because one of our observations is that there's a lot of disconnects in this ecosystem, and that it isn't always obvious to entrepreneurs, as Galen mentioned, like where to go, who's doing what, how to get the information. So really appreciate the role that you're playing in that piece, as well as all the other things that you're talking about. All right, so now at this point in the panel, I'd like to go back to the entrepreneurs, go back to Nadine to talk about, she's with Someone Somewhere. It's a Mexican social entrepreneur enterprise that has had success in accessing Delta Airlines corporate supply chain. And then now, more than a year and a half or so into the relationship, I'm sure there's some interesting challenges that arise as you ramp up the production and try to meet the needs of such a large partnership. And so Nadine is kind of coming from a slightly different perspective of saying, okay, we've got this partnership now. What are the challenges and opportunities and experience that we see from that vantage point? So Nadine, thank you so much for joining us today. And we'd love to hear a little bit about your experience at Someone Somewhere.
Thank you for having me. Hello, everyone. Bridget mentioned Nadine Abdullah, head of growth at Someone Somewhere. We've had a very interesting experience, but before we get into those challenges and the lessons we've learned in this, I did want to talk a little bit about Someone Somewhere so you understand our business model and how we uniquely kind of use that to enter into conversations with corporate partners. And so I'm going to share my screen. So a little bit about Someone Somewhere. It is a Mexican company. Essentially, it was started by three best friends who were able to go and understand a little bit more about what's happening in rural communities in Mexico. When they were there, they were able to see a bunch of beautiful cultural richness that exists in these rural indigenous communities, but they also saw some really hard facts. The first one being that there are a ton of artisans that live not only in Mexico, but Latin America and Africa. A bunch of them live in extreme poverty. 90% of them are actually women. And so activating women within the artisan community is very important and very interesting in terms of alleviating poverty. And then if you actually look at how many people are in a family and touched by all of these women in these communities, there's over 1 billion people worldwide that are impacted by extreme poverty through artisanal work. Then there's the textile manufacturing industry. So being in Mexico, something that has been very interesting is obviously nearshoring and proximity to some large companies, such as the US and Canada. And so we've actually been really working hard to improve the textile manufacturing industry and use this as a nearshoring opportunity for our customers and corporate clients. So kind of similarly, there are 500K, a little bit of a smaller group of manufacturing workers in Mexico, but 50% of them actually make less than the minimum wage in Mexico. And 83% of these people are also women. With those two problems in mind, let's look at the apparel industry, which is what Someone Somewhere does. And we know that that's a great pollutant in the world. 10% of all CO2 emissions come from apparel. Wastewater due to dyeing products can actually come from the apparel supply chain. And then 60% of the clothing or textile world is actually made from plastic or plastic driven. So what does that mean? It means there's three problems that we really wanted to tackle. And so Someone Somewhere was actually born. And we're a social enterprise on a mission to lift millions of people out of poverty through actually creating jobs. So sustainable jobs, and then also regenerating textiles to use them in our material goods. How we do that really quickly is we conserve the artisanal made techniques with the artisans. We collaborate with them. We make sure that that's at the forefront of everything that we do. We source and centralize sustainable materials to make sure that we have that sustainable element in everything that we have. Modern and functional designs. And then something that I want to talk about today is our unique supply chain that allows us to be able to actually work with corporate and enterprise partners. And so our unique supply chain is interesting such that we are the only organization right now in Mexico that is able to activate communities and build capacity at scale with artisanal work. And so we do that with a lot of technology, some of our sales channels, but also a lot of capacity building in the communities. Something very special about us, Someone Somewhere, is our name. And so someone is for the artisan that actually made the products, and somewhere is for where they call home. And that's something that we include in all of our products as well. I'll quickly jump through these slides because I do want to talk about the Delta partnership, but we are a registered B Corp. We joined the ranks of many B Corps in the world, kind of really focusing on verifying their high standards of performance, transparency, and their entire value chain. And then we recently became climate neutral this year, which we're very excited about. And what that means is obviously we have a commitment to reducing our CO2 emissions, as well as many environmental initiatives. Let's get into how we work at Someone Somewhere. Initially, we started off as a direct-to-consumer brand, but seeing the size of the problems that I shared initially, and seeing the opportunities that exist in working with the corporate sector, we really thought about diverting everything into B2B. And so, as you can see, the problems around there in the artisanal sector, industrial sector, and our planet can be solved by 3 solutions that we've actually created. And a lot of that came from inspiration from Delta. And so the solutions that we've done to work with corporate partners is, the first one is reverse engineering. That's to say, if you have a product within your supply chain that you want to match in terms of cost or make cost neutral, but still have an impact in the communities, still have environmental impact, what you can do is kind of engage Someone Somewhere, or we would work with you to understand how do we find efficiencies in creating that product, but do it in a way where we're still paying artisans, manufacturing workers, and using sustainable goods. And so that's a solution that we think is really interesting. And we wanted to make it such that we understand the businesses that a lot of you on this call come from, and cost neutrality is very important. To the extent that we can, how can we make it easier for organizations to work with Someone Somewhere? The next one, which I'll share a little bit more about when we talk about Delta, is new product development. So how do we reimagine a product that perhaps was in your value chain or should be in your value chain and create something net new alongside the artisans, but with impact, cost, and everything in mind at the onset? And then the last one, which is around simple sourcing. So this is to say, if you have an event or if you're onboarding as an organization. I used to work at Accenture. I received many backpacks when I was at Accenture. And so wouldn't that be cool if those products were actually made sustainably, made with social impact in mind, and made by Someone Somewhere? And so these are the 3 solutions now we're using to actually talk to organizations in a language that makes sense, because there are needs that make sense to them and that they need immediate help for. All that to say, let's talk about the Delta partnership. So Delta came to Someone Somewhere with the desire to respond better to their customers. I think a lot of passengers were looking at the airline industry and thinking about how do we make this more impactful and more sustainable. On an organizational perspective as well, they had a lot of challenges in terms of the lead times and their innovation agility as they were sourcing from the East. And they want to reduce their cost of ownership compared to their obviously previous amenity kits. So if you look at this, it's a little bit of reverse engineering and the new product definition that we talked about in the 2 solutions. And so we were able to actually work with them. And now we're directly impacting 2,000 people that are making these amenity kits in Michoacan and Oaxaca, some of the most vulnerable states in Mexico. We are at over 1.5 million hours of artisanal work throughout our partnership. And then we were able to reduce the CO2 emissions and also plastic use on the planes through the amenity kit redesign. How we do that, and I'll talk about some of the challenges in all of this as well, is we had to actually build and bolster a lot of things within our organization. Obviously, we had an in-house design team, and so design is very important working with these corporate clients, especially when customer experience or user experience is at the forefront. But our biggest challenges kind of going through our supply chain were around sourcing and procurement. And so the reason for that is obviously sustainable goods or regenerated cotton, recycled polyester, for example, are actually a lot more expensive in terms of products, as well as not so readily available. And so we've worked very hard to actually change that kind of supply chain for our partners. And so we're working with organizations to actually create our own threads, to use more sustainable materials. And so that has been one of our key takeaways kind of going into this new challenge or chapter that we've embarked on that we're calling social procurement. We have a product development arm. Our planning arm is actually very important. And this is not only just planning within our manufacturing side of things, but planning and building capacity in the artisanal communities was a challenge that I'll get to in a bit. Production in the artisanal communities is split across these two communities, as well as we have many different factories that are making the amenity kits and the eye masks. I'll quickly go through these, but we have the whole gamut of possibilities, and having all of these parts of the supply chain actually make it easier because we become a one-stop shop in working with our corporate partners. And so this is something that we worked very hard to develop, such that it's very easy to switch and have an impactful decision-making process when buying products. But just to cap this off, logistics, sustainability, what we're really proud of here is that we measure all of our impact, and we make that very transparent to our partners so that they can understand the impact they're having, as well as the benefit that they're having in their communities. I'm going to skip the design process because I know I'm getting low on time, but I'll talk more about the amenity kit. So these amenity kits that we created for Delta when they came to us with this initiative was made in China. It was made of virgin polyester. It had a 36-week lead time, which is extremely slow in terms of agility. It was actually creating 1.5 million kilograms of CO2, and it was actually wasting 3 million gallons of water because these were dyed units, and they had a $2.1 USD landed cost in the US. And so what we did is completely changed it. You can see some of the Petalum fabric that was used in the amenity kit here, but made in Mexico, made of certified recycled polyester, as well as regenerated cotton. We moved everything to a 12-week lead time. So we were able to actually start our production within 12 weeks. And now we're iterating with them on a monthly basis, which is great. We're carbon neutral, like I mentioned. And so that is something we're really proud of. No water usage, no dyeing is actually created in the regenerated polyester threads, because we work with some of our suppliers to help in terms of color grouping to reduce with dyeing. 2.3 landed costs in the US, so a little bit more expensive, which Delta was willing to pay for, obviously, the social impact. And then we're raising 2,000 people out of poverty, which is beautiful. I'm almost done. So let me talk about the challenges, the most important part, and the lessons that we learned. The first one was, like Bridget mentioned, capacity was very challenging for us. To build capacity in Indigenous communities to this extent is something we had never done before. And so really working with our impact teams to create that capacity was, I would say, our key success factor. And so what I will say as a lesson learned, there is sufficient artisanal and industrial capacity out there. It's just around building scale and capacity in those communities. And so what we found so beneficial in working with Delta is asking for that time, asking for that 3-month lead time to allow us to start capacity and test the waters. And I think real partners, or what we're seeing with our corporate partners, are invested in your growth as a company too. And so complete transparency around giving us time to build that capacity was very helpful. A second challenge, obviously, was financing. We're a smaller social enterprise. And so how do you get creative around financing to allow for mission-based companies to drive impact and change? And that's something that was a great success factor with Delta as well. We created some really beneficial payment terms such that it would not impact the way that we were buying products, materials, or paying artisans and manufacturing workers. The third thing, which was challenging, obviously, and I heard a little bit more on this call today, is there are a lot of decision makers within these organizations that we want to work with, especially in building large programs like Delta. And so catalyzing this change really comes from executive support and being a little bit bold and visionary and breaking some rules. That's what we saw with Delta. But again, someone somewhere is able to kind of fit into any decision-making process within an organization. We're part of many diversity supplier groups. And so we're able to kind of understand how these large and not so large companies work. Another thing that was hard for us was around storytelling. A lot of people didn't understand what an artisan was in the past, but we found this to be a really big success factor, especially in making business decisions. And I wrote down here, business decisions are also heart decisions. And so how do you make sure that those two go hand in hand and not that they're actually on different ends of the spectrum? And that's what we're trying hard to do here at Someone Somewhere. And then partnerships. So we're trying to partner with a lot of organizations like Delta to really reimagine their value chain. And that is it. I think I took more than 7 minutes, but hopefully you get a sense of how we're working here at Someone Somewhere, how we've changed the way our entire business work to adapt to changing demographics of what businesses care about, and really start our social procurement logistics kind of chapter.
Thank you so much, Nadine, for sharing the story of Someone Somewhere and Delta. And what I'd like to do now is just sort of open up the conversation for a few minutes. I'm sure many of you have questions for each other, but maybe the first set of questions we could ask the social entrepreneurs to give feedback to, Tim and Alex about their programs, and I'm sure you may have questions. So let's see what types of feedback you might have.
How much does your central corporate strategy affect the priorities you have as far as the social enterprise relationships that you're building? Is it sort of an independent entity or operation that feeds back to the corporation, or is the corporation sort of saying, hey, we want to enter this market or this sector, can you go find interesting opportunities there? Or, how does that whole relationship work between your corpus and strategy and your social enterprise strategy?
I don't mind answering first, if that's okay. And look, and Dee's on the call as well, and I'll ask Dee to consider the comments that I make and make some as well. Look, the enterprise will establish strategy as a company of what we want to be, and that will then migrate to what are fairly independent business units that execute, certainly in the upstream, but downstream as well. And we pride ourselves on that strength of the local business, if you will. And so I think I'm going to answer I want to answer your question as directly as I can. It will be the local business that drives it for the local footprint, right? And it's going to be across what are the priorities for that business in that environment. I'm sitting in Perth this evening, and so it'll be the Western Australia, then Australia, and then Pacific region that I would look to, probably in that order of importance, with guidance from the corporation of what kind of partner we want to be. It will be aligned with the overall business strategies and intent. Sometimes there will be we want to move forward in a certain way as directed by the corporation, but generally the businesses and the business units will drive it in geographies. And Dee, please, if there's other color, don't hesitate.
Yeah, I think probably the other color I'd add to that, Tim, is in addition to the procurement decisions being structured like that, so are our social investment decisions. So whilst a business unit might have a particular local content or supply diversity approach, the social investment strategy may also come along to support that particular approach. So it is a very local sort of approach to where we invest our social investment dollars and then also our procurement dollars, but it is driven by an overarching guidance from the corporation. Absolutely.
And Alexander pointed to some examples of SAP working in that space, and it really resonated with me, the challenge that she articulated from the corporate side in getting that going. It's really a testament to your efforts to have, I think you said 800 folks working with companies, the non-monetary assistance that they give. And look, just for full transparency, Galen asked me a question, activities of Chevron in a particular location, geography. I don't know the answer to that. I have to go look to see what that is. And so that is just a perfect example in my inability to respond to it off the top of my head of just how big we are and how hard it is to accurately communicate. Yes, this is where you go. This is who you talk to. It's hard for us to put our fingers on that. We can find it, but it's a challenge.
In such a large corporation like Chevron is or SAP is as well, I think all of these decision-making processes are multi-layered, right? It's sort of you have sort of the corporate element that sets more the strategic guidance and says, okay, this is what we're going to focus on a high level. But then particularly from a procurement perspective, it's really the individual buyer who makes the decision. But our job then is to ensure that we create visibility of diverse suppliers in our vendor base, basically, right? And I think that's the one thing that we've been struggling with, is sort of making sure that we get enough social enterprises uploaded, so to say, as vendors into our system, and make sure that they're recognized as social enterprises. And then it goes hand in hand with a lot of training and education of the individual buyers, because you basically have to explain to them, why should you, why do we want you to not go with your tried and tested suppliers when you have need for a product or a service? Here's why we want you to look beyond that, right? And here's why we want you to look at the social enterprise. That requires a lot of training effort. So it really is pretty multifaceted, I would say.
I think there's a lot of really interesting implications also for organizations like Miller Center in terms of how might we engage on both sides. With the entrepreneurs that we work with, as well as some of the corporate partners, to help provide that connective tissue, because it sounds like there's a real knowledge and communication gap, and many times language gap, knowing even how to talk to these kinds of partners. So Baida, did you have something you wanted to add here?
Yes. Can I just add one thing? Sorry, Baida, because I think, we've been working in this space for so long, and I'm wondering sometimes if we're putting too much of an emphasis at the moment in trying to drive social procurement on large corporates. And I'm actually, I've started to think about, wouldn't it be better if we actually start bringing the SMEs into the conversation much more than we have been doing? Because I actually think that SMEs locally could potentially be easier and better partners for social enterprises to get their feet wet from a B2B perspective. Because if I also think about what Nadine was saying, how they were building up these partnerships, those are really intense, very high touch partnerships that require a lot of, trust, thinking, and time to build up that kind of partnership that then results in revenue. So anyway, just a thought that sort of has been developing on my end and on our end in the last few months, that I think we need to do more in bringing the SMEs into the conversation.
Mm-hmm.
No, I agree, Alex. I think that's a perfect segue. Was what I was trying to say is we put too much ownership on the corporations, but there is a huge language barrier, and there is a lot of bridging and connecting work to do that Miller Center is doing. But from my perspective, I think it always brings me back to, as a passionate advocate of women and girls, I think where are we being intentional about bringing women and girls into the supply chain, and how are we measuring that, and what are we doing to build a future pipeline of that, right? So one, we don't understand the issues, and two, even if we do, it's becoming really hard to integrate. And I want to hear from Dee, as a female leader in the space, what do you think that corporations can do better to integrate women into the supply chain very intentionally and consciously? Because I think as much as there is noise about this subject, there's very little being done and intentionality behind it, because it's so hard to achieve. Right. In my role as Grameen, I think for me, it's to build the pipeline of future social entrepreneurs, because I understand the deep-rooted barriers that prohibit women from achieving their full potential. And I think there is a role that we need to, as corporates, as NGOs, as social entrepreneurs, that we need to build. And I want to hear from both Alex and Dee, actually, on what you think about the intentionality there and what can we do better.
I think we probably need about 3 hours to go into that in a great deal of detail. I think there's a few things that we can do. So, Tim mentioned we have a supplier diversity policy at Chevron, and women-led businesses are intentionally called out as part of that. And so if you're looking at a competitive tender, and you actually do consider things like, are you comparing a woman-led business with a non-woman-led business? It can be part of the selection criteria. And so there may be parts of a different business unit's decision process where they want to emphasise, we really want to increase the amount of women-led businesses in our supply chain. But there's other parts of that as well that we can work on at Chevron. I sit on the social investment side. So how do we actually help build up women-led businesses in the ecosystem at that smaller level? So that's working on everything from women's education, right at the very basic levels, women's STEM education, women's empowerment, teaching communities around good governance, financial skills, financial literacy. I work in a program in Bangladesh, for example, that's working with village development organisations, and it's very focused upon building women-led businesses, but setting them up for success through things such as teaching them how to use laptops, how do you manage cash flows, and how do you build good governance systems. From there, linking them with markets and creating market linkages and then strengthening those market linkages. And that's a very long process. So I think there's two levels we can work on it. One is trying to look at what is the reasons why women actually aren't involved in a particular supply chain, in a particular context, and can we work on some of the fundamental, I guess, the grounding parts of that question. And then there's also having policies within our procurement or a philosophy within our procurement to increase the amount of women-owned businesses too. So I think it's both ends of the spectrum. Alex, I'll hand over to you on that thought.
Yeah, I think there's, like at Chevron as well, I mean, when we're looking at diversifying our supply chain, we're looking at it from different components, and one component is diverse suppliers. And within diverse suppliers, I would say the best organized is on purchasing from women-owned businesses. And I think the reason why that has happened on the SAP side is because we found a partner in WeConnect who is able to provide that transparency and visibility of women-owned enterprises that we can purchase products and services from. So that has proven to be quite helpful. The other thing that we have seen is that, and Subhadhi, you know this much better than I do, but the fact is that when you look at the social enterprise sector, a lot of the social enterprises are women founded and women led. I mean, not all of them, of course, but a lot of them are. So I think when we work with social enterprises, we don't take a gender lens to it. I think as long as we make sure that we build capacity on all levels for a social enterprise in making them ready for a B2B market, then at least we're also covering some of the elements that need to be covered from a women empowered perspective. Now, I don't think that is enough per se, but I think that's sort of a step in the right direction.
No, thank you both. I think I was just trying to put a comment there, Alex, that, I 100% agree with Dee and Alex that a lot of work is happening, but I do believe that, again, as Dee said, it's probably a much longer, deeper conversation. But Alex, as you said, social enterprises are women mostly, and there are co-founders, but the amount of funding they receive, if they're an individual woman-led founder or than if they are with a co-founder who's a male is significantly different. And I think those statistics need to change and people in this do it. And in the spirit of corporate partnerships, we are working with JP Morgan Chase and another bank. I'm kind of missing out on the name, on actually doing kind of converting informal women entrepreneurs and bringing them into the formal economy, getting them ready for the B2B. They're not necessarily social entrepreneurs yet, but they're the future pipeline that can move from an informal economy to a formal economy. But thank you so much. I think in the spirit of corporates being one of the key stakeholders in this system, it's such an important conversation to have, and I'm glad all of you are thinking about it.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely, absolutely. And actually, as part of our partnership with Chevron, we are collaborating with a professor at Santa Clara University, Maya Ackerman, to do some research exactly on this topic around bias and the differences, really digging into the reasons why women founders really receive just a teeny tiny fraction of the capital and resources that they need to succeed relative to male founders. So yeah, that's a really important topic. And I also agree that the corporate partners have such an important role to play because you have so many resources. I appreciate your point, Alex, about the SME, the smaller businesses. And I think that's pretty much where Galen has really succeeded quite spectacularly across East Africa, is partnering and selling into, kind of some of the local and smaller businesses. But I think that the scaling opportunities with companies like SAP and Chevron and Delta and many of the others we're talking about are just very attractive, obviously, because ultimately what social entrepreneurs want to do is scale the impact they're having on the ground, and the extent to which these larger players in the market can help facilitate that, obviously, is the better. Right. So any other comments or feedback that anyone would like to share at this stage before we wrap it up?
Well, just thank you, Bridget. I think this was an amazing session, and it's very important as a starting point to understand the language that entrepreneurs and corporates kind of struggle with. Miller Center for playing that orchestrator role at this point, and I'm sure others can contribute as we move forward.
Yes, absolutely agree. Thank you so much for having all of us and all of the insights. I've taken a lot away to take back to our teams, but I do agree with Zubaida. I think one of our biggest challenges was, how do we speak the right languages in these corporate organizations, and how do we make sure we're coming to them so that they understand our language as well? And so having these types of conversations and bridging that gap is so important. And thanks for this initiative.
Great. Well, listen, let me I'll just make a couple of concluding remarks here. I think this has been, from my perspective, a fascinating conversation. As we've all said, there's so much more that needs to be done in terms of education, communication, information, between entrepreneurs, social entrepreneurs especially, and corporate partners. I really appreciate the role that Chevron is playing in trying to bridge that gap in the different ways. We talked about the diverse range of opportunities for entrepreneurs to engage in the supply chain. Tim mentioned the direct, the indirect, and the kind of government type programs. I think that's super helpful to understand that there are the different pathways and which are the best pathways to to choose or to understand. And I think also when Alex talked about all the different ways that SAP gets involved, it's really quite broad, from employee engagement to the direct procurement, but then also all that stuff in between, the ecosystem building, the platforms that you're building, the partnerships that you're working on. I think that's a critical step forward. When we hear from Zubaida and Galen about their insights and trying to crack the nut, Zubaida talking about women and girls and pushing that to the forefront, as always, really appreciate that. And then, of course, Galen and Jibu really making huge strides in, you can't really drive anywhere in East Africa without seeing a Jibu sign somewhere. So obviously making great strides, but probably a lot more that can be done. And then again, Nadine, thank you so much for sharing your story. I think that it really illustrates both the opportunity and the challenge. So once you have the partnership, then then what? And all the different dimensions in terms of the sourcing, the capacity among the communities, I'm sure there was many systems issues also that needed to be addressed there. So we're really excited to see what happens next with the partnership between Someone Somewhere and Delta Airlines. And so I think with that, I would like to thank everyone once again. Thank you so much, Dee and Chevron, for supporting Miller Center with this kind of activity. I would also like to thank my colleagues, Karen and Rhonda, for all the hard work that you put into organizing this amazing webinar, and look forward to the next round of discussions that we might have on this topic. I hope that in the future conversations, the idea of large corporates like Chevron or SAP partnering actively with social entrepreneurs will be sort of mainstream, a mainstream concept instead of an edge, a marginal concept. So once again, thanks everyone. And I hope you have a good morning, afternoon, evening.